Coming back, I had to decide. I was accepted back at University of Illinois and at Penn State for a master's in educational administration. Why I choose that, I have no idea. But I chose Penn State because my sister and younger and older sisters, both of whom married Mennonite dairy farmers from near the Harrisburg area. Kathy was from Harrisburg. My parents had moved out there. Penn State was 2 hours from Harrisburg. We lived in a trailer. About that time, Andy was born. He was born in 71. And I was a master's student there. I had an assistantship. Penn State's a nice area. It's in the middle of the state. It's not Philly. It's not Pittsburgh. But it's nice. And, of course, I became a fanatical Penn State football fan, which is frustrating. But that was a good year. I was on the GI Bill. I had an assistantship. Kathy was basically taking care of Andy and raising Andy. I got a job as a kind of an intern at a public school in middle school. I was a middle school principal in Kane, Pennsylvania. That is cold, known as the icebox of Pennsylvania. It was there that John was born in 1974. And that was a good job. It was 600 kids in this middle school. You know, Kane is kind of isolated, and so it was an easy job. But I got to the point where the GI Bill is running out, and it was time to then go back to Penn State and work on my doctorate. At that time, we were close. Kathy's parents also lived in Harrisburg, so we had a lot of family support, and returned to Penn State in 74, 5, and 5, 6. I supervised student teachers at State College High School, and then I worked on my dissertation, and I had a committee. I was a full-time student. Most of the people in education administration, they have full-time jobs. So they come to Penn State campus, they take a Friday night course, they take a Saturday morning course, they go to the football game, and they go home. But I was there full-time, and being there full-time, that has some advantages because you get to know the professors. So I finished that in 2 years, and Kathy was extremely supportive, allowing me to do that. I appreciated the time at Penn State. I would not go back there. I would not send my children there. I think the whole wokeism and the whole left-wing control at major universities is pretty bad. But it's a pretty campus kind of in the middle of the state, and I appreciate being there. And then in terms of the public schools, I was in Kane for a couple of years. After I got the doctorate in 76, I went on active duty with the Army at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. I was there for the whole summer, didn't have a job. In Carlisle, Pennsylvania, which is a kind of well-known town in Pennsylvania. It's the home of the Army War College, Dickinson College. It's a nice little suburb of Pennsylvania. And somehow my name was recommended, and the superintendent was fired, and the assistant superintendent called Penn State, and they recommended me. And there I was, 10 minutes from my parents and a half an hour from Kathy's parents. So we took that, and I became assistant superintendent at the Carlisle Area School District. Those were 8 of the best years. You would think, well, why were the public school years good? I think that it was mainly because I was one of the few evangelical Christians on the campus. So, like if they had some liberal sex ed program, we kind of run it by that fundamentalist Edgren first, kind of. But you were more on guard, and your testimony had to be clear. But they had respect. That's Mennonite country. It's conservative, but I was the most conservative. But those were good years. The other thing I remember, we lived in one home for 8 years. We never lived in one home for 8 years, although we have now since we came to Columbia. But Kathy started a process of sponsoring refugees. That was the period when the boat people were coming. This would have been in the late 70s, early 80s. So we sponsored a Vietnamese Christian couple. They lived in our home for 6 months. They came to Harrisburg. They had a baby and a suitcase. That's all they had. Now both their sons have graduated from dental school, and they're living in Oklahoma, and God has just blessed them. But they lived with us. And then a Laotian couple lived with us about this. And we taught them both how to drive. That's a good way to have a nervous breakdown. Teaching an Asian with stick shift. But I look back at that time and Kathy's initiative, and that was so precious. I had a very nice job. I was assistant superintendent, 10 elementary schools, 2 middle schools, 2 high schools. I made the bullets. My boss shot them. I wasn't like a principal dealing with discipline. I had an office job. Those were 8 very good years. And I remember I learned so much from my boss, who was a very, I'm not sure he was a Christian at that time, a very sincere, Methodist guy whose daughters told me he did become a Christian later. He had 3 daughters, and I think I was kind of like his adopted son. He was 14 years older than I was, but I was there from 1976 to 84. And yeah, I complained about the public schools, and I'd like to be in Christian schools, but that man taught me more about how to be a good administrator, how to be a person of your word. There's some I could give an hour video just about him. But the conclusion of that Carlisle time is that both Kathy and I have always been very pro-life, and we would go down to the Right to Life March in D.C., not every year, but often. That was a good year for us spiritually. That's another matter why those things are that way. But one day I read an article in the Harrisburg Patriot and in the Carlisle, the 2 newspapers, and it was written by a liberal guy who was making the case for abortion. Well, I wrote a letter to the editor defending the pro-life position, and I didn't think anything of it. Any third graders should be pro-life, I'm thinking. Well, the next board meeting, in board meetings in most schools, it's the superintendent and maybe the assistant superintendent. The principals don't come to board meetings typically. I'm sitting in one of the chairs on the side. Carlisle is a fairly conservative town. I think of the 9 board members, I think 4 of them were Christians, at least 3, and they were supportive. But one of the lawyers in town, I still remember, she's my age, Ruby Weeks, I can remember. She was so upset with that letter that I wrote that she looked at me and she virtually screamed at me, like, how dare you write that letter? You can't do that. You're an officer of the state. Which is true. In Pennsylvania, the superintendent and the assistant superintendent are actually officers of the state. So, no, you're supposed to be neutral. 4 board members defended me. No, it's okay. You can write that letter. But she was livid. And that was our experience of the handwriting on the wall. I went home and I was hurt. I mean, I look back now, all these years later, I think she was right. I think she was right, technically. But at the time, she never came to see me personally, which I thought was not right. And my boss did not defend me. He might have told her to bring it up. I don't know, but he was a great, great man. I think Kathy could sense, I think maybe it's time to leave. And so we'll go on to the next section about how China happened.